Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. Today we're finally talking about altitude. We've focused a lot and probably lent into our biases about heat and especially passive heat. We're big fans of the bath on this podcast, but we've got a really good interview today with James Barber. James is the lead performance specialist at the Altitude Centre, which is a centre that allows you to experience and train with altitude in London. He's also a PhD student at Anglia Ruskin University. His PhD is looking at optimizing heat mitigation strategies for ultra runners. James is also a runner himself. And yeah, we get into the nitty gritty, I guess, of altitude, what altitude actually is, what maybe misconceptions people have, some of the physiology at play at altitude, and then how you can use it to train. Yeah, I think a really good chat. Nice to actually, talk about altitude. Because realized we hadn't done it, and then some of the chat during the World Cup about altitude sort of reminded me, oh, we haven't actually really talked about this. We've maybe skirted around it and talked about going to altitude a bit ourselves, but never had that deep dive. So yeah, I thought a really good interview.
Yeah, and I think we talk about it on the episode, but for me, you go, oh, it's never altitude podcast, it's never altitude conversation, and now we've known about altitude for 60 plus years, and ever since Mexico City Olympics, people have started to really think about, or can altitude be a tool? Athletes have gone to altitude camps for decades now. So I always think it's a little bit old, a bit stale. There's not much new there, but actually, talking, in the interview, just discussing with James. But really, there are so many user cases for altitude, and it probably isn't just to do with going on a camp for 4 weeks in that traditional environment. There are definitely different ways that you can use altitude to really optimize your training, potentially induce new adaptations, and just increase the stimulus as well of a key session. So we talked about using it in a rehab process, using normobaric hypoxia. So that's simulated altitude to prep you for a training camp, or even just to using it combined with high intensity training to induce some more potent adaptations. So a really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed talking to James. It was a really good, really good chat.
Yeah, I think that's probably the takeaway for me as well is not just, you don't just go to altitude and do the same thing, because that won't work. And I think if you do that, then you're probably going to be someone that, in quotes, doesn't respond. But that's maybe as much not using the stimulus correctly. There's things that you should change when you go to altitude, and there's potentially different sort of training stimuluses that you maybe wouldn't think as much about at sea level that you could do at altitude to get a bigger benefit. I think that's probably where the stimulus is going, rather than just go on an altitude camp and you'll get some benefit. And actually, I think the science has maybe picked that apart slightly and maybe driven people to be more, far more specific. And that's probably the same really with the baths. Like we talk about it in the interview, but we know in reality you can't do 5 baths a week for 5 weeks or more than 5 weeks. At that point, you're either physically or mentally or relationship wise absolutely burnt out by the baths. So it's how do you actually use them as a dose over a couple of weeks and long term to get the benefits. And yeah, that's a really good sort of area we went into with James.
Yeah. And I think just looking further ahead, what is the future going to look like in terms of using altitude and heat? Probably not at the same time, but in sequential steps to maintain and increase the hematological adaptations, maintain what you've built, and continue to long-term go from one baseline to the next and continue to grow those hemoglobin mass adaptations. So I think it's actually a really interesting space, and it's actually become more interesting because of the new found love of heat and how can it be used together to really optimize preparations for major events.
Yeah, definitely. I think also fundamentally, like a lot of elite athletes are still going to altitude, but it's picking apart what they're doing at altitude. That's the what people need to look at and what research needs to capture as well.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so as always, we're sponsored by Soar. Um, super hot at the moment. Go check out the warm weather gear. I'm just on the new arrivals. Maybe not warm weather gear, but I do fancy a pair of the Soar jeans as well. I reckon those maybe not to run in, but to go get a pint after a run. I
Have
reckon
you
the Soar
seen these
jeans.
records where it's like fastest marathon in a pair of jeans?
Yeah,
That sounds absolutely horrendous, doesn't it?
I think the guy's on drugs as well. I don't think
I don't
I
know
don't
who it
think I'm
is.
going too far out there to say that.
No?
I don't know.
All
Maybe
right.
we'll get cancelled for me saying that.
Yeah, called out now. No,
Yeah.
no.
No, worth checking out. Just go through the new arrivals on the Soar website. The trail running packs are back in stock as well.
Oh, I was going to ask about that. Yeah,
Yeah, no,
that's
they look really good, and you sort of know with Soar gear that it's been stress tested. We mentioned back in talking about jackets back in winter when you needed a jacket every day to run in, and the the stress testing and the design journey that a product goes through with Soar is really interesting. So yeah, worth checking out. You'll laugh at me for this. You laughed at me when I said this last time, but go check out the designer notes video on like the Soar trail pack. It's worth having a look at Tim talking through how the garment came to be and the iterations it went through as well, because I think that then gives you an idea of its use case.
yeah.
So yeah,
I mean, I've had lots of cheap packs and they're just uncomfortable and
yeah,
annoying. But if you get one that's good and well fitted, it makes a huge difference. You just don't notice it's there. You forget about it. Whereas, I mean, I did a long run the other day with one and I had bruised ribs afterwards from just the bottles just
yeah.
slamming into my ribs for nearly 3 hours. And it's
Yeah.
just not a pleasant experience. And
Well,
yeah.
I remember we said when we got some of the trail kit last year, didn't we? And the trail tops had like a extended collar. And I remember saying to you, like, it's a small little detail, but when I've done trail races before, I've had like actual friction burns on my like neck because the pack is rubbing there. So just the fact that they've designed a t-shirt to be worn under, uh, with a trail pack that then reduces an irritant that I had for a sort of 4-hour race. But if you're running for 24 hours, like that would potentially really impact your race. So it's just those little details which are really cool and part of what we really like about Soar, isn't it? That those things are
Yeah.
considered and designed into the garment.
Yeah. And I think the technology here just allows you to go and properly fuel your training. Like the packs, for example, I would like personally, I would always look at someone wearing a pack and what you're doing. You don't need a pack. You just go, I can go run for 2 hours. I won't eat or drink anything and I'll be fine. And I can go and do that. But I've realized that you recover so much better and you're so much less of a hole if you do properly fuel your runs. And taking gels is great. But in this environment we're having at the minute in the Northern Hemisphere, actually, if you're out for 2 hours, you should be taking hydration with you.
Yeah.
And that makes a massive, massive difference compared to not. You can get away with it, of course you can, but you're going to have a much better time and enjoy it more and recover better and be able to just do more training if you've got technology that allows you to go and take bottles with you.
Yeah.
Like cyclists aren't questioning it. Cyclists aren't going like, should I take hydration with me or not? They're just going to take it. That's
Yeah.
partly because it's easy, but you can make it easy for yourself if you have the right kit. So
Yeah.
definitely,
100%.
I'm going to be getting one of these packs. I need to upgrade. My ribs would appreciate it.
Yeah.
In addition to Soar, we're really excited to have another supporter of the show back with us, which is Currans, the New Zealand black currant supplement. So I was using it this winter, and we were all using it this winter, and there's so much added benefit, so many known benefits to using Currans. So if you're a runner focused on the finer details of performance, recovery, and long-term health, you'll want to know about Currans, a new powerhouse in polyphenol nutrition. Currants is a New Zealand blackcurrant extract that's been recognised as the European Sports Nutrition Product of the Year, and it's become a favourite among runners of all levels, from everyday marathon runners right through to elite ultra-endurance athletes. Backed by over 60 human trials, Currants has built a reputation in the running community for its broad-ranging research-led benefits. It's trusted by athletes who put their bodies under serious stress, including world 24-hour champion Sarah Webster. I used it myself, as I said, in this 2:11 marathon build-up going into Seville, and generally felt a difference in my rate of recovery and just how consistent I could be in training. It's easy to use, batch tested, and suitable for runners across the spectrum, whether you're training for your first 10K or chasing a marathon PB. You can get a 15% discount from your first purchase using the discount code Physiology15 at currans.com, a link in the show notes. So go and check that out. As I said, really, I generally did notice the benefits in terms of muscle recovery, and that's where the most evidence lies for its ability to just reduce muscle soreness post-training, but definitely a good evidence basis to support increased rates of fat oxidation and potentially also augmenting your ability to store and maintain muscle glycogen levels throughout a training block as well, which is obviously going to have massive ramifications to your ability to be consistent in training and turn up and just keep executing sessions consistently to a high level. So yeah, link in the show notes, go check them out.
Yeah. Thanks for the support, Store and Currans.
Another thing I'm really excited to talk about today is the expansion of our coaching provision. So first of all, we're so grateful to everyone who's reached out to us over the past few months for one-to-one coaching. We generally appreciate you putting your trust in us as a team to help you achieve your race goals. We don't take that lightly. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to support everyone who's filled in the interest form on our website. We just can't support all of you, I'm afraid. It's a very deliberate decision, but we want to maintain our high quality of service and make sure that we give the athletes we're working with the best chance possible of reaching their potential. So to help address that, we've been working on other ways to support more athletes, specifically those who might not need as much one-to-one input from us, but would still benefit hugely from an evidence-based, well-structured training plan. And that's what we're excited to announce today. We've published a 12-week marathon plan designed to prepare you to run your next PB. The content of the plan is very similar to what we would give the athletes that we're working with on a one-to-one basis. Inside, you'll find a whole series of videos as well explaining how to execute each week. So there's weekly videos there that will tell you about how you should execute each individual session, about the nutritional requirements of those sessions, how to warm up, etc. And there's also additional content factoring in, or how you should factor in things like races, injury, illness. How should you adapt to that plan, basically, to make sure that it isn't something really fixed, but you should just carry on with regardless. It's more organic than that, and you're getting advice from myself, Jen, and Owain on how to customize that plan to make it fit best for you. There's also additional videos covering race day itself, like how to carb load, how to pace your marathon so that you reach the best race you can possible, the best performance you can possible. I think one of the real key components of this plan is that we prescribe using a training zone system that's anchored around physiological thresholds. So drawing from all my experience in the lab, testing hundreds of athletes of a whole range of performance levels, I've taken race paces, heart rates, RPE, and mapped that on to physiology-based training zones. So looking at the lactate responses and the VO2 responses to an incremental exercise test. And this allows you to use a whole host of intensity metrics to really make sure that you're executing each session correctly. So you can use heart rate, RPE, race paces, what have you, to really help align and coordinate the intensity so that you're working at the correct intensity for a given session. Currently, we only have one marathon plan available, and that's aimed at runners looking to do 6 to 7 days a week of training. We're really hoping to expand that catalog, and honestly, we hope that by this point, because we've been working on this for quite a few months now, that we would have a bigger catalog to offer you. But basically, we've just put a lot of work and effort into getting this plan to a really high standard. And hopefully we can expand, or we will be expanding, the catalogue of plans available over the next few months. If you're interested, head to theendurancecollective.co.uk and you can go on the What We Offer page and you see underneath our one-to-one coaching offer and also a 12-week plan outline. And you can then head to the training plans tab and they are available to purchase. They're currently retailing at £90 for the 12-week plan. For that, you'll get a PDF with all the training sessions in for 12 weeks, about 20 videos, potentially a few more than that, outlining, as I said, how you should structure each week and how you should go about executing the key sessions, etc. Any questions, send us an email, drop us a message, and we're more than happy to help clarify. Thanks for your support.
Should we leave people to the interview?
Yeah, go and enjoy. I really enjoyed this one. Definitely, definitely one of my top episodes of the year.
Yeah. So we're really excited today to be joined by James Barber. James is the lead performance specialist at the Altitude Centre, and he's currently undertaking a PhD at Anglia Ruskin University about optimizing heat mitigation strategies for ultra runners. And we're really excited to talk about altitude today. We just said off air that we've been doing this for 2 years now and we've barely mentioned altitude. So good to talk to James about this. So yeah, thanks for joining us, James.
No, it's a pleasure. I think, the altitude thing, it's almost become a little bit unfashionable, as we were saying. Like, the heat thing is so interesting these days and so accessible for so many people, but there's such a history with altitude. Think of all the people that have spent so much time at altitude training and the gold medals that have been won off the back of it. Yeah. So hopefully interesting to have a chat about that today.
Yeah. I guess we just wanted to go straight in and just, fundamentally, what's different if you go to, Font Romeu or San Moritz or even high, Sierra Nevada, what's the environmental challenge to start with that you're going to face in one of those locations?
So it's all about oxygen, right? So I think the misconception that people have is that the concentration of oxygen in the air, people think the concentration of oxygen in the air changes as you go up the mountain, but it doesn't. It stays the same. So right now, 21% of the air that we're breathing is oxygen. But as you go up the mountain, the pressure drops, the barometric pressure drops. So the way I'd always describe that is, right now, it's a bit like we're sitting at the bottom of a swimming pool. And if you sit at the bottom of a swimming pool, you can feel the pressure of the water pushing down on you. And so we've got that right now with 28,000 meters worth of air, like literally pushing down on us. So barometric pressure is really high. But as you go towards the top of the swimming pool, you feel that pressure start to dissipate. And exactly the same thing happens with the column of air that's above you when you go up the mountain. So there's less air pushing down on you. So when you go up the mountain, 21% of the air that you're breathing is still oxygen, but it's as though it's 21% of less air. So every time you take a breath in, you're taking in fewer molecules of all of the gases that make up the air, the carbon dioxide, the nitrogen, and the oxygen. So there's less oxygen going into your lungs with every breath. Which then means less oxygen going into your blood, less oxygen being pumped out to the muscle and to the brain, and less oxygen going into the tissues there, which is why then everything becomes so much harder when you're at altitude. But then that also becomes the stimulus for us to adapt and hopefully see some pretty big performance improvements over time.
It acts on pressure gradients, right? And the oxygen. Oh, the word slipped my mind now. But you see the graph where like the starting pressure is lower, so it means that everything is lower.
Yeah, exactly.
Going through the system, right?
Yeah, the oxygen cascade, and so it's not a completely uniform drop in the oxygen cascade. Certain areas are more affected than others. And the real issue, or the real, so the oxygen cascade is describing the pressure gradients between the air in the lungs and the blood, the pulmonary circulation and the peripheral circulation, and then to the muscles. And so the real issue seems to be the flattening of the oxygen cascade and that diffusion gradient or pressure gradient between the peripheral circulation and the muscles. So we're not actually able to get enough oxygen out from the blood and get it into the muscle. So if you were to take a NIRS device or something and look at the amount of oxygen in the muscle, then you've got a significantly reduced amount of oxygen there, which is a big problem.
What's the knock-on effects of that then on the key physiological parameters? So VO2 max, threshold economy. What's it actually doing to our physiology relative to sea level?
Yeah, it's a big problem pretty much from straight away. So if we've got some kind of altitude-induced hypoxemia, so the amount of oxygen in your blood is lower, then you're going to obviously have a reduced VO2 max. There are a number of different ways of quantifying that. I think common wisdom is that probably about 6 to 7% reduction for every 1,000 meters above 1,500 meters is something that's banded around quite a lot. A couple of percent per 200 meters above sea level is something else. There was some data from the late 90s from the AIS when they first set that up, that even just being in Canberra at about 600 meters above sea level was sufficient to start dropping VO2 max about 6 or 7%. I think they thought all the VO2 max testing kit was broken. They just opened this brand spanking new Australian Institute of Sport, and everyone was suddenly testing 6 or 7% down on where they'd been at their various regional institutes of sport. But actually, they realized that it was just being at 600 meters was having that impact. So yeah, massive impact there. On VO2 max, which is probably the most obvious one, but your thresholds are going to be down as well. And there's some kind of interesting physiology there around how actually altitude depletes your bicarbonate pool a little bit, so you're a bit less able to buffer to buffer hydrogen as it comes into your blood, that sort of thing, which is interesting and very challenging. Running economy may be interestingly because the air density, if you're in normal and if you're in hyperbaric hypoxia, so you've got low air pressure, maybe your running economy has improved a little bit. I don't think that's something that's been looked at massively, but it's literally less resistance to push against, right? So it makes sense that could be a little bit improved, but I don't think that's something that's really been looked at too much to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic like Mexico City Olympics, isn't it? Yeah. Where all the endurance athletes, their performances fall off a cliff, but you're getting long jump world records, like the sprint, they're absolutely flying in the sprints because the air density is so much lower.
Yeah. I can't believe it's taken 10 minutes to get to Mexico City, because it just seems to be where every conversation starts around altitude, because it was such a flashpoint for it. The 5 and the 10K were about 6 or 7% slower than they had been in the years either side of that. As you say, that long jump record stood for decades, didn't it? So it's definitely something in that.
It's still the Olympic record. I looked it up the other day before the football, and it's still the Olympic record. It's not the world record, but and that's from the 60s, right? It's 1968. I want to say. Yeah. You think about every other record has been absolutely annihilated, but that one still stands. So it shows the difference.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. That's mad. That's incredible. That's cool.
Yeah, it's also when they go to do like the hour record in cycling on the track, they will often go to altitude because although obviously we've got less oxygen available, the reduction in drag is so much higher when they're going up those sort of speeds. But there's actually a sweet spot there in terms of you're not going to go to 3,000 meters, but actually going to 1,500 meters is probably more optimal.
Yeah, exactly.
But
anyways, I guess we then wanted to sort of dive into some of the sort of physiological mechanisms at play at altitude. So if we went to do an altitude camp, what's going to sort of happen physiologically over the first few days and maybe a couple of weeks?
First few days, you're going to have a really horrible time. I think, to be honest with you, it's going to be really hard. So being up at that sort of altitude immediately, because you've got less oxygen available to you, you start hyperventilating a little bit more so. So you're breathing more quickly, more deeply, just to get more oxygen into your lungs in the first instance, from which to extract the oxygen, get it into your body. But your heart rate's also going to be elevated off the back of that. So if you've got less oxygen in your blood, your heart has to pump more blood around the body to maintain supply. Kind of makes sense. But also because you're breathing more quickly and more deeply, you've got an elevated cost of breathing, basically. And so your heart has to pump a little bit faster to supply your respiratory musculature as well. So the first couple of days is really tough. And actually on a traditional altitude training camp, going for 4 weeks or so is necessary because you almost can't really train properly for that first week. Your training quality is going to be poor. Sleep quality might be impacted as well, just a little bit, but enough. And ability to recover is going to be quite poor as well. But over time, you start to acclimatize. You get through a little bit of a lag phase there. And training is still much harder, obviously, when you're actually up there. But the magic really is in that duration of exposure. So being up there for that amount of time, we've got we've got these this gene and this stabilizes to form this protein HIF1 alpha, so hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha, which is stabilized in hypoxia. And basically everything that's good about altitude seems to come downstream from that in some way, shape, or form. So the headline, I guess, is always going to be around red blood cells. People think, you go to altitude, your kidney senses that you've got a lower oxygen tension in the blood, secretes EPO, the EPO travels to the bone marrow, stimulates stem cells to become red blood cells, raises your oxygen tension in your blood. Great. That's fantastic. That definitely happens. There's a rule of thumb whereby probably you get about a 1% improvement in hematocrit for every 100 hours spent at altitude. That's a fairly well-established thing now from meta-analysis in the early 2000s. But there's a whole heap of other things that are happening around that as well. So if again you think of that journey of oxygen from the air to the muscle, the blood is just one part of that. We need to be able to breathe slightly differently, transfer oxygen at the lung, get it into the blood, and then probably some of the most interesting things are what happens at the muscle. And so that ability to draw oxygen from the blood and get it into the muscle and then use it is really meaningful, and I think overlooked a little bit as well.
Are you able to talk through that sort of muscle level stuff? Because I think I always tend towards the blood changes and the benefits from that side of it.
Yeah, I mean, so the blood is definitely the headline, but the muscle I think is really interesting. So a lot of it stems from angiogenesis. So HIF1 alpha has a downstream target of VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, which is responsible for developing new capillaries through the muscle bed. So you'll have significantly greater perfusion of the muscle with blood and therefore with oxygen. And if we go back to our sort of GCSE biology, physics, whatever it is, just thinking about simple diffusion, that's going to make everything much more straightforward, getting oxygen from the blood then into the muscle. We've got more diffusion surface area, less distance for the oxygen to diffuse from the blood into the muscle and then go into the mitochondria. And then, that improvement in the mitochondrial density and efficiency as well. So upregulation, basically things that you would expect from training, but just upregulated. So, but mitochondrial density, efficiency of the oxidative enzymes in the mitochondria, that sort of thing as well. So actually that ability to use the oxygen significantly improved as well.
I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Altitude is just making the whole training experience more stressful and adding more load. So you probably are going to just benefit more from every day-to-day training.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, I mean, part of why people who have got a good handle on the altitude research will say there might be a little bit of debate around altitude, is because it's always hard to match training load in the research. And it's kind of an interesting methodological thing. Is like, if you add the altitude, you're adding more training stress. So does the benefit just come from doing more training stress? The really good studies will account for that, and they'll match for internal training load as well as and have a group that matches for external training load. But just having that additional stress is provided it's well managed, is where a lot of it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone now wants to head up a mountain, don't they? But after hearing that, but obviously there's challenges to being altitude as well. Are you able to talk a bit about what the obstacles are to training at altitude?
Oh yeah, massively. I mean, we kind of touched on it a little bit there, I guess, in that if you go for you want to be going for a long period of time. So you want to be going for kind of 3-4 weeks ideally, because you're going to be losing that first week or so of high quality training. So it's quite a long duration. Obviously that comes with cost, all of those sorts of things that you want to be thinking about that just factor into day-to-day life. But the big kind of physiological thing is, if you have less oxygen available to you, then if your training quality is compromised, that might be a problem at certain times of the season. If you're a middle distance runner, or even, kind of 5,000 meter runner, and you're looking to develop a finishing kick, and you can't run at those intensities in training, is there going to be a problem later on with trying to reach those intensities in a race? Possibly. If kind of conventional wisdom is that to race fast you got to run fast, and you're throttling that a little bit by being at altitude, maybe there's a bit of an issue around that. Maybe that can be overcome a little bit by thinking about the timing of your camp. So maybe some people are moving towards using altitude camps more in like base phases, where you can just not worry too much about the quality of your training, just get heaps of training done, and time it around competition in that way. But that's also where then some of the simulated altitude training techniques, the sleeping at altitude or using altitude chambers or altitude generators come in as well to mitigate some of those challenges as much as anything else.
I wanted to ask about the impact on sleep, and there's quite a lot of research about apneas, which people seem to experience at altitude. You okay to explain what's going on there and why people might suffer?
Yeah, absolutely. So often that's something that is maybe experienced at slightly higher altitudes. If people are climbing to Everest Base Camp or Kilimanjaro, probably less so at the sorts of altitudes we're dealing with training. So possibly important to contextualize that. If you're training at altitude, probably we're looking somewhere between 1,300 and 2,500, 3,000 meters. Everest is 8,848 meters. So it's quite a band that we're dealing with. But the apneas happen because overnight your breathing slows down a little bit. So you're less or expelling less carbon dioxide overall, and the carbon dioxide starts to build up in your blood, which triggers then your breathing reflex. And because you're not breathing as much naturally overnight, your body basically wakes itself up and you sort of gasp. You get this gasp response is a thing, which is not inherently dangerous, but it's a sign that people are not acclimatizing that well to altitude. And it obviously that's disruptive to sleep quality if that's happening a couple of times a night. And so we do see then, it's great now with things like Whoop bands, Aura rings, that sort of thing, the level of detail and insight that people are getting on sleep, the quality at altitude. You're seeing things like time in deep sleep significantly reduced, light sleep increased, reductions in HRV, that sort of thing, which I think is really interesting to be looking at.
What about, I know you said that maybe doing your altitude camps in more of a base phase makes sense, but would you be worried about the time course of the drop in the adaptations? I mean, I think there's quite good evidence, isn't there, to say that the hematological adaptations you get, that increase in red blood cell volume, drops off quite quickly once you come back from altitude.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with that. And as soon as you come back from altitude, your body's basically going, I don't need these red blood cells now. I'm not just going to wait for them to die off. I'm going to actively go and destroy them. So your body actively is getting rid of the adaptation to some extent. But what we're seeing now is people taking a really long-term approach to their altitude training. So this is something that again, there was a great paper on this, Inigo Majiko, who you guys will know, 2019 or something, looked at kind of the long-term periodization of altitude training. And of course, if we're thinking about really high-level athletes, they're not just thinking about a short-term thing, they're thinking about 4-year cycles. So they're going, actually, I need to peak in 4 years' time. How do I build my altitude training up during that time? So I think what we're moving away from is thinking of altitude as being this one and done thing and going, okay, how can I use it at this time to elevate my training through the next block? And then when I go into my next block, am I then using altitude training again to achieve this purpose and so on? Because with the decay thing, it's not as though somebody's going to altitude, they're getting super fit, and then when they come back, they're just going to sit around, eat Dominoes and get fat. They're going to continue to train, right? Hopefully. So if it's elevating the level at which they're then training, maybe there's this like sequential improvement in fitness that happens actually over a long period of time. And maybe it's best used like that.
Yeah, I mean, when I've had conversations with Andy Shaw, who's the UK athletics physiologist, and his PhD was on altitude as well, he said they've got all this anecdotal evidence, but tracking hemoglobin mass like long term for 4, 5, 6 years in these people who are just going to altitudes like periodically over the years, there is just this chronic growth in hemoglobin mass.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily see that in most people who are just training at sea level all the time. But I don't know how much research there actually is in that space. It's really hard to track these really long-term adaptations, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's where people like that are so well placed to talk about those things as well, because it's something that research isn't quite catching up with. If you think about how you're going to run a 4-year training study or an 8-year training study over 2 Olympic cycles, and then how you're also going to capture things like, what we're seeing now is that people go on an altitude training camp, but then when they come back, they'll use simulated altitude training to to keep some of the adaptations. They might dose in some heat at other times as well. So, we can't just think about it as an isolated thing anymore, which I think is really cool, but and makes the conversation really interesting, but also makes it a little bit harder to say, oh, you should do this, you should do that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that's the next steps, isn't it? Is how do you integrate everything to that you're building, then maintaining those adaptations over time.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely papers coming out, aren't there, on using heat or simulated altitude to maintain what you've built, and then maybe you can just go into another altitude camp and boost up to a new level again.
Exactly that. Yeah. So take that long-term approach.
I guess we've sort of our natural bias is towards endurance athletes, but are you able to talk through some of the like training benefits of doing like repeated sprint training in hypoxia? And just on that, even I saw a video that EF, the cycling team, put out a few weeks ago at their altitude camp, and they were doing like quite high intensity sprints. Like they were in Sierra Nevada, I think, and they were right at the top of the mountain doing it, which, these guys are riding for 5-6 hours a day, but they're doing these very high intensity bouts of repeated sprints at altitude. So that set it off in my brain. Like, okay, what's different? Why are they doing that in that location? Like, what's the combination at play?
Yeah, it's such a potent way of training, and it comes a lot from the team sports guys. So kind of 2012, 2013, it started this idea of like repeat sprint training in hypoxia, mostly for footballers. So this idea of being able to sprint maximally, having already sprinted and having had incomplete recoveries. There's a really cool study. They basically did an open-ended test where they asked people to do sort of 10-second sprints, max effort, so no intensity cap whatsoever, short recovery, I think it's about 20-second recovery, and just do as many as they possibly could before and after a bunch of doing this type of training in hypoxia. And just significant improvements in peak power output, mean power output, the number of sprints they're able to do, really kind of trigger this idea of repeat sprint training in hypoxia, which has been taken on particularly by football clubs. So most Premier League football clubs will be doing some kind of training like that, and also in rugby. We had England playing in Johannesburg this summer. They were doing a lot of repeat sprint training in hypoxia in preparation for that. And we're definitely seeing that taken on more so by the endurance guys as well, because it's basically doing that really high intensity stuff is a massive stimulus for desaturation of the muscle with oxygen. So again, if we were to take that NERS device and look at the amount of oxygen in the muscle during a repeat sprint, it would be so low. And that's a really potent stimulus for a couple of things, but predominantly for that angiogenesis and that improvement in the capillarization of the muscle. So if we're doing those really high intensity sprints, developing those new capillaries, perfusing the muscle bed with more oxygen, then over time, that's still going to have some benefit for our endurance athletes. And I think there's also probably this recognition from the endurance athletes that although cycling, for example, is still a predominant, it's an endurance exercise, it's one in those high intensity moments, and it's very stochastic in its nature in that sense. If you're doing an alpine climb, you might be going uphill for 45 minutes, but actually the key moments are the really high intensity bits, the attacks, the hairpins, whatever. So having that high intensity and that actually slightly oddly for altitude training, but that improvement in glycolytic capacity is probably really important for those guys as well to actually win races.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a Cardiff Met. There's a bit of an altitude tent and the rugby team in that.
Yeah.
But I think they did it on a Thursday morning, so after they'd been out the night before, and I think there was people throwing up whilst doing. I think they were on watt bikes in this altitude tent throwing up. So definitely don't do that. Don't do it after your night out.
Yeah, I wouldn't wish that on anyone.
Professionalism, doesn't it, of Cardiff Met rugby team? But anyway, yeah, I think it also goes back to what you were saying earlier, James. But it's not exactly, you can still work at high intensities at altitude, but the output is obviously reduced.
Yeah.
And so I think I've certainly heard of athletes going to altitude, especially for middle distance athletes who are actually, they do need that top end speed, but making sure you don't just go into complete base mode, and you give yourself the ability, like longer recoveries, to go and run at 400 meter race pace, 800 meter race pace, and not lose those qualities as well.
Yeah, and it's just about, I think that's about them. That's what I was just going to say. That's about kind of smart coaching at that point as much as anything else. You go, well, actually, we want to be running at these paces. It's quite hard to do that. Probably we need a bit of extra recovery. it's not. I'd like to think that's not necessarily rocket science, but yeah, it's just thinking about it a little bit more like that.
Yeah. So obviously you're at the altitude center in London. Obviously London is about 0 meters of elevation, not 2,000 meters of elevation. So can you talk us through normobaric hypoxia and how we go about creating that?
Yeah, so everything that I described at the start about how the oxygen concentration stays the same, it's the pressure that drops, basically it's the complete reverse of that. So rather than faffing around with pressure lock doors and all the rest of it, basically with normobaric hypoxia, you're not changing the air pressure, you're just simply reducing the concentration of oxygen in normobaric air. So we have a couple of altitude chambers here. So the whole room is in normobaric hypoxia. So right now, 21% of the air we're breathing is oxygen. We have a big altitude chamber, which is at 15% oxygen, about 2,700 meters above sea level, which is a little bit higher than you might go to on a traditional altitude training camp, which is kind of interesting. We have another chamber which we can take up to 5,000 meters, or we'll do it off a smaller generator with a mask-based system. So you might have seen, particularly in the team sports, we tend to use that a little bit more, and we can individualize the level of altitude a bit more on that. So yeah, that's a slightly different type of altitude training. That traditional altitude training camp we call like live high, train high, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to live high at altitude and train high at altitude as well. Whereas this, as you say, being in London, you're living low, but then stepping into an altitude chamber to train high. But we could equally use that equipment, the generators, to flip that, live low, basically live high because you're sleeping at altitude, but then train low because you're training at sea level.
I guess, so if someone was to implement training or using that as a stimulus, how would you go about adding that? If someone's got a marathon sort of 12 weeks out and wanted to add that, what sort of like protocol or things would you be considering?
I think you don't really want to be changing your training too much to account for the altitude. It's more about bringing the altitude, the training that you're doing into that altitude environment. Traditionally, you would say, and certainly from the research, you would say you want to be doing your kind of harder sessions each week in there. So you might be training in there 2 or 3 times a week, doing those harder sessions to get a little bit more bang for your buck from that, and then continuing to train normally outside of that. What we have also seen in the last number of years is that because the altitude can dissociate your internal workload and your external workload, there is some benefit to doing some easier running and some recovery type stuff in there as well. So, if you're a treadmill runner and you're usually doing your easy running at 12 kilometers an hour, and that gives you a heart rate of 140 beats, well, maybe you could get into the altitude chamber and do it at 11 kilometers an hour, and that still gives you a heart rate of 140 beats, but your joint loading, your ground reaction forces are significantly lower. So maybe there's a point to strategically put that into your plan as well. And so we will have people who do basically all of their training in there, barring sort of the longer runs or maybe those very long sessions, because frankly, why would you do that on a treadmill? But yeah, so it's kind of interesting how it's transitioned maybe from those really hard sessions, which is definitely what we see in the literature, through to maybe using it a little bit differently as well.
And are those people doing anything like having an altitude tent at home, like sleeping in normobaric hypoxia?
Yeah, some people will. So it's very, very much personal preference thing, because I think a lot of people would probably consider that to be the gold standard of altitude training now, because you don't have to go away from home. You can individualize the altitude that you're sleeping at according to the person, but then also really specifically around the training as well. So if you have a really hard workout that you need to recover from, you sleep at slightly lower altitude. If you've had an easy day and actually you can prioritize pushing the altitude up a little bit, then you can really, like on a micro level, periodize the altitude somebody's sleeping at. So yeah, I think sleeping in an altitude tent is probably the gold standard many people would consider at the moment. That's something that you probably look at. Ideally, you do that on a repeated basis, because the issue is always like, when does peak performance come after using an altitude tent? For some people, it's almost straight away. For some people, it's a couple of weeks after you stop using the tent, and you've kind of improved your sleep quality, you've freshened up a little bit. So ideally, you'd have a bit of a dry run at a B race before then, putting all your eggs in one basket for a, Valencia Marathon or something like that. But yeah, generally speaking, sort of a 4 or 5 week block at some point pre-race is what you're going to be looking for.
And are you seeing people combining it with like passive or active heat as well?
It's a tough one to do in that sense, because the combination can just leave your body feeling a little bit overloaded. From the 5 week heat study how hard that is to do, and your recovery. If you're sleeping in an altitude tent, there's an argument that your recovery is going to be impacted slightly as well. So I wouldn't necessarily look at doing them both at the same time. Sequentially, possibly. You might do a block of sleeping in an altitude tent and then go really hard on your hot baths and then get back into a tent and use them, sequentially like that. But at the same time, I'd be a bit worried about just overloading. And then at some point, like, your body's still adapting most to the running that you're doing. So if you're not able to run, then are we doing too much other stuff? Would be my concern.
How much normal baric hypoxia stimulus do you think you need to see those hematological adaptations? Because when I've talked to people before, they go, "Oh, you would really see the benefits of the sleep high, train low approach. Then you need to be in about 10, 12 hours a day." And do you think that's realistic, or do you think actually you can, if depending on, can you compensate maybe by going at higher altitudes and not spending so much time attached to a mask or in a chamber?
It's a great question. It's kind of it's what we're everyone in the field is basically trying to work towards, is to understand that. Because I guess there's two ways of looking at it, and like the time thing is one thing, but then like what's the physiological impact of that as well? Because if the three of us all spent exactly the same amount of time, exactly the same amount of altitude, we would have a different internal response to that and an internal stress to that. So there's almost two ways of looking at it. Like when you look at the meta-analyses, the rule of that kind of 1% per 100 hours in a tent is like, that does hold. That's a pretty good rule of thumb in general. So looking at, and then if we look at kind of the acclimatization literature, so people who are looking to go to really high altitude, we generally say that acclimatization comes from maybe 200 or 300 hours in a tent. So across the course of a month, 8-10 hours overnight, a little bit of time during the day if you're an elite athlete, or supplementing that with some mask-based stuff might be useful. I think it is realistic, but I'd probably, rather than look at doing higher altitude for less time, I'd probably try and look at doing lower altitude for more time, because otherwise you're just risking sleep quality, recovery, all of those sorts of things as well.
Yeah. I think it's really nice, like the normal baric hypoxia, and that you've got so much control over it, isn't it? Like, I think that's one. Going on an altitude camp is a blunt tool. If you're struggling at altitude, well, you've probably just got to go home. It's not that easy just to drop down 1,000 meters.
Exactly.
And, find some accommodation down there for a bit. Whereas, like you said, if you can increase and reduce the dose of the stimulus so easily in these artificial environments. But then the challenge is, can you get enough stimulus?
Yeah.
I mean, I imagine that one of the big user cases is probably getting ready for an altitude camp. And exposing, sort of trying to, if you can't go away for 4 weeks, well, but you can do 2 weeks of simulated altitude beforehand, or maybe you just reduce the shock to the system of that first week when you are at altitude. Is that what a lot of people are using your services for?
Yeah, absolutely. Some people are. So yeah, we've had people going to Form Remote or somewhere like that, particularly if they're going for the first time. Maybe there's some kind of like almost hypoxic memory whereby the second and third time you go, you get a little bit better at dealing with it in the first week. But particularly the first time somebody goes, they could be wiped out that first week. So using really some of the principles that we would use to pre-acclimatize someone if they were going to try and summit Everest, but just a little bit less of it. So even just completely passive exposures to altitude can be really beneficial for that. You literally just sit. It's called intermittent hypoxic exposure. So you sit, you're breathing through a mask, which is doing 5 minutes at high altitude, 5 minutes at sea level. So a bit like doing interval training, but just for your acclimatization, really. Trying to drop the blood oxygen saturation low for that 5 minutes in hypoxia, and then allow it to recover for the 5 minutes at sea level again. And just building that up over the course of a couple of weeks can be really, really potent for your acclimatization and lessen, as you say, that impact of the first week or so of being in altitude.
So I think a big part about acute adaptation and how some people seem to cope with it very well, very quickly, isn't it to do with how we change our breathing frequency and about hyperventilation? So it's not necessarily increasing your hematological state and getting more red blood cells. It's just actually starting to hyperventilate appropriately.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a really important point, because red blood cells take a long time to develop. So the early phases of acclimatization come from your, we call it hypoxic ventilation response. So you start breathing more quickly and more deeply. The problem with that, though, is that there is a cap on that. So when you're hyperventilating, you're expelling so much carbon dioxide that you get that your blood becomes quite alkaline, and your brainstem notices that. It doesn't like it at all. So it kind of throttles the extent to which you can hyperventilate a little bit, until your body then starts to adapt. So you then start to get rid of bicarbonate from the blood that leaves the body in the urine. So that has two effects, I guess. When you've got less bicarbonate in the blood, you're less able then to buffer build up of hydrogen ions, which is why your training is impacted. But that loss of water in urine is very dehydrating. So part of the impact of being at altitude is that you're very dehydrated to begin with, as much as anything else. So yeah, the early phase is very important with the ventilation, but it's still not without its costs, I guess.
Mm.
Is there anything that you find maybe suggests someone's going to do better at altitude or struggle? I know people talk about iron and ferritin levels, and it's maybe it's more important with people you're seeing that are going to do high altitude mountaineering, rather than like Fon Rameau is probably not too bad. If you're going double the height, it's maybe more important, right?
Yeah, exactly. To be honest, the thing that consistently comes out of the literature is basically, what does the blood oxygen saturation do when you're exposed to normobaric hypoxia in a really controlled way? So we'll actually just run tests on, so, if somebody's climbing Kili, for example, then we'll go, look, okay, come in, do some testing. And all we're going to ask them to do is breathe various different levels of altitude and track their blood oxygen saturation across that exposure, and compare that to the literature to look at how they're getting on. So it's a really straightforward test to do, but really important, really valuable. And it's something that we would also do, with people who are going on training camps. So for exactly that reason, are you more likely to struggle, less likely to struggle when you're there? The iron thing is important, and that's going to be more about the adaptation that they can expect to get. So if somebody's low on iron, then because you need the iron stores to grow your red blood cell count, if you're low on iron, then you're not going to get that same response probably. So yeah, getting your irons, your ferritin checked is probably going to be a useful thing to do if you're planning on doing a significant amount of altitude training.
Is there something in that as well that if it is an athlete who does desaturate massively when you expose them to a given altitude stimulus, are those athletes going to get more benefit though from the altitude and that it's a bigger stimulus, or are they just going to not cope with it's just too much stress and they're just not going to cope very well?
Yeah, I'd lean towards the second one, because bear in mind that the majority of the benefit that you're getting from altitude training is still from the training, and then the altitude gives you a little bit more. So if the impact on your training is too much that you're not training at a high quality, then you're going to have some issues there. So yeah, if somebody shows that they are a little bit more susceptible, then you're going to have to make some adaptations for them in the first week or so of an altitude training camp. Lower intensity, more recovery, things like that. And then you're just kind of on watch a little bit as well, because if they're not recovering so well, are they then at greater risk of getting ill, getting injured? Are there things that you need to do to support them on their training camp as well to stop that?
I wanted to. We've talked about the benefits and how altitude works, but I wanted to ask, like, what's your thoughts, sort of, I guess, on the wider, I don't know, just the wider research. I know there's a few papers that sort of question some of the benefits. There's the sort of famous is it Morgan and Dempsey paper? That sort of questions some of it, and it goes to the typical, like, training camp benefit.
Yeah.
Saying like you can't really separate. But yeah, what are your thoughts? And when you see altitude literature, like what sort of things are you looking for to say, okay, this is better quality than other work?
Yeah, it's a really important point, because if you read the literature, you would think that it's a really mixed bag, and it is. If you were just to put it into PubMed and go altitude training, go, it is a really mixed bag. A couple of things that I'm looking for are, I think the main thing is kind of something that we discussed a little bit, is what the what account did they make for increased training load. So some of the best studies, and it's really hard to do with live high training studies, but with train high training studies, ideally you kind of have almost like three groups. You probably, or maybe even four. You probably have a group that probably four groups, two groups that train at sea level, two groups that train at altitude. You probably have then those groups matched for internal training load and for external training load. So you'd match them for things like their heart rate, or if they're training according to lactate or intensities that are dictated by their ventilatory thresholds. You'd have groups at altitude training at their relative sea level intensities and their relative altitude intensities, if that makes sense, so that you can distinguish between the two. I think that's probably a really important thing, because if you just did a straight training study where you had a group at sea level and a group at altitude, and they're both training at X% of their sea level LT2 twice a week for 6 weeks, the group that trains in hypoxia is going to have significantly greater training stimulus, because they're training at a much higher intensity. But if you also had a group that trained at altitude at their altitude, and the intensity was set according to their altitude LT2, then probably you'd have a fairer comparison, if that makes sense. So I'd look for some kind of training load comparison there. And I'd also have a look for, if you're doing any kind of reading on altitude stuff, I'd also have a look for how they have accounted for individualizing training and individualizing, but both training and dose of altitude. Because if you read a strength and conditioning paper, and you read, and the title of the paper is back squats don't improve leg strength, but they've given everybody in the protocol the same weight to lift, you go, well, that's a appalling protocol. Everybody's lifted 100 kilos. Some people are only able to do 1 rep, and they couldn't do any training, and other people that wasn't nearly enough, and it wouldn't get published. Whereas for altitude, we go, oh, being at 2,000 meters doesn't work. You go, well, it might work for some people and it might not work for other people. But from a practitioner's point of view, you're going, well, why didn't it work for those people for who it didn't work? Because there should have been some stimulus there, but we've got to unearth why that's actually the case, why that's not worked for them. So I think it's two things. They're really hard to do. It's not me having a go at people who've done altitude research. It's really hard to do, but those are a couple of things that I'd be looking for.
Yeah, one of the papers we've broken down is the Christoph Siebermann, like the double-blinded altitude paper, and just like the level of detail in that to just do a double-blinded study, which is the gold standard in other fields, is quite remarkable, so and that's what should be done.
And it's so hard. And then even when you look at some of the studies from the US, and they go, well, they've done double-blinded stuff, but then they've been let down by technical issues with generators, or this sort of thing. It's such hard research to do, which is why I think definitely we're looking at the research, but then from an applied point of view, we're looking at, does it work? And actually, well, if the training camp effect is part of it, is that such a problem? I don't. That's a genuine question. I don't know. Maybe that is part of the effect as well. There's definitely a physiological effect, but maybe just having that additional training focus is a good thing for everybody anyway. If it makes you run faster.
Exactly. That's what I was just going to say. An elite athlete doesn't really care how it made them faster. If it made them faster, they're going to go and do it. Yeah. And if that means going out to Font Romeu and training in a nice environment with fewer distractions and really being focused, maybe the altitude doesn't add very much, but they got faster. So that's a win. In terms of, one of the applications I think I see for normal hypoxia is making the use of that decoupling between the internal loads and the external output. So do you think using it for either rehab where someone can't run at fast speeds is a good use of normal hypoxia, or maybe actually thinking about running is so limited by the fact that you're supporting your own body weight. Could you maybe do more training whilst getting a similar stimulus by, like you said earlier, reducing the speed, having less biomechanical stress on the system, but also now being able to just do more training because of that? Make sure this keep the intensity high.
Yeah, I think the rehab thing is really interesting. We've seen an awful lot of that in the last number of years, particularly driven by the football clubs, which is really cool because they've got access to hypoxic chambers and hypoxic generators. And if you have a footballer that you've just bought for how many tens of millions of pounds and they're sitting on the bench, that's not a good return on your investment. So they've kind of exploring every possible avenue to get people back on the pitch. And so the model that we've kind of developed and worked on, and then actually published on this a year and a half, 2 years ago now, is basically a model for how we can integrate hypoxic stimuli in the complete return to play protocol. So actually, maybe there's a role for hypoxia in healing, particularly in bony injuries, but possibly also in muscular injuries as well. Hypoxia is a really important stimulus for the development of like woven bone, so in fractures, which is really important. So that passive exposure to hypoxia that I was describing before might be useful for that. And then, as you say, through that early phase, you're not able to load completely normally. So running at lower intensities, but getting the same internal workload as though you were doing more work at sea level could be good. And then for that top up, before you get back to competition as well, to raise the level at which you're training. So I think there's something in that. And then possibly an underlooked part of that might be doing some resistance training in hypoxia as well. So probably come across like blood flow restriction training. One of the key stimuli that creates is like a localized hypoxia within the muscle. And there's some really nice research to suggest as well that if we basically do resistance training in environmental hypoxia, then maybe we're creating like a systemic hypoxia and we're able to do a similar thing. I don't think it's better than doing blood flow restriction. That's certainly not what the research does. It's probably equivalent where it's been looked at, where they've done a comparison, a control, a BFR and a resistance training and hypoxia group. But maybe there's like an ease of accessibility, ease of implementation sort of thing. Along similar lines, if you're doing, we've all been injured, we've all been given banded exercises and all of these sorts of quite low intensity things to do. If it's a way of getting a little bit more bang for buck from those sorts of relatively light intensity activities, then that's a useful thing to do all the way through to then your, heavier, max strength type training as well. There might be some benefit to doing that in hypoxic conditions as well.
I was just interested to ask I guess quite an open question, but do you see any sort of trends or training, ideas or coming from the sort of high altitude mountaineering world into endurance sports? I'm always quite interested in the like crossover from other sports.
Yeah, it's interesting. Mountaineering is such a traditional sport that actually it's something that's only really taken off in the last couple of years, because you basically got this thing with like Everest, right? That traditionally it's a 60 day expedition. But if people want to do impressive things, you can't go higher, so you've got to go faster. So we've seen things come in. Last year we worked with a group that climbed Everest. They were only away from home for 7 days, which is pretty mad, really. But the other slightly difficult thing is that mountaineering isn't governed by the same anti-doping rules that sport is. And so they were also doing some things around like xenon inhalation, which
I wanted to ask about this,
which is really interesting. So they were doing some stuff around that. So I think actually in many ways, like, because that's more of a medical thing, they're actually learning a lot from sport. And we're at the mountain medicine conference in Hathersage earlier this summer, so in May. And actually this is very new technology for people who are in that sort of environment. So they're learning a lot from us, which is quite nice.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about xenon. So this was this group last year that inhaled xenon, I think like 2 weeks before they went to Everest, and it seems to increase the amount of, it induces erythropoiesis. And then, like you said, they went from London to Everest and back in like 7 days, where normally it's like a 60-day trip, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, look, it's been so controversial in that world.
Yeah.
I think it's super interesting, and it's something that's being offered commercially now in Germany. Look, I think it's really interesting. So xenon is a banned substance under WADA. You can't take it, but it's basically this gas that's used in anesthesia. Uh, it's 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 probably a really good anesthetic drug, or gas. It's really cardiostable. It works really well. It's probably the thing. So we consult with a cardiac anaesthetist who's a high altitude doctor, and she said, well, look, if you had the choice of which anesthetic you're going to use, you probably use xenon, because it's so good to work with. It's just massively expensive. No, I don't think anybody really quite knows how it worked. There's this idea that maybe it did promote a sudden release of EPO and a sudden production of red blood cells. There's also this neuroprotective thing that's been put about, that actually maybe it's accepting that our brain is going to be exposed to some degree of hypoxia during that sort of time. So actually, maybe maybe the thing is not to prevent that, but is to help our brain deal with it when it inevitably happens. So maybe there's something around that. But look, I mean, the guys that used it, they were successful. The mountaineer that's promoting it says he's used it a number of times, says it works really well, and I think it'd be really interesting to see where that goes. To be honest with you, it's very controversial in the mountaineering world, but I think it'd be really interesting to see what happens with it.
Yeah, I mean, like I remember seeing it last year, and there was I found it just now, the big like Nat Geo article about the sort of the debate about it, and I then wonder, like, can you actually test for it in the same way that carbon monoxide sort of kicked off as a you could potentially use this from a cycling perspective, and again you can't really test for that, and we've used it at Cardiff Met, and we sort of said, like, you have a slightly higher level of carboxyhemoglobin if you just ride your bike behind some cars. So, how are you going to separate that? Or you have a couple of cigarettes, right? And then you've got a bit of a higher level. So how do you test for it? And yeah, people are going to experiment, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't even know how you go about testing for that. It's one and done, and then I guess it's probably a banned technique as well, and you're looking at EVP and all of these things. Yeah, God knows. But anyway, don't do it for sport, but maybe it's quite cool for mountaineering. I think probably put that out there.
And just to clarify, we don't endorse taking xenon gas before, in any context.
Spend your money elsewhere, because you presumably got loads of money lying around if you're going to use it.
Yeah. Just go and enjoy a nice altitude camp instead. James, where's your research heading? What are you up to at the minute?
Yeah, so slightly differently, as Owain said, my PhD is looking at optimizing heat mitigation strategies for ultramarathon runners. So we know from lab-based studies really what people ought to do to get, like, should we say, quote unquote, maximum levels of acclimatization. But we also see from the field that that's so hard to do. And so looking really to begin with at what athletes actually do. So as a little plug, if you're an ultra runner and you're racing in hot conditions and you want to get involved in research, then I've got a survey live which they can fill out to tell me how they prep for a race. So we're looking.
We'll put it in the show notes for you, James.
Thank you. That'd be great. So we've got that, and then looking at kind of what they should do from the research and from an applied practitioner perspective, and then that's all to set up kind of a big lab-based study. We'll be looking at some techniques that might be able to support that heat acclimation process. I think part of the thing is quantifying training load, how hard that actually is for people to do. And then if there are some ways that we can support that and make it easier for people to do their heat acclimation, then that'll be really important as well.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's nice seeing. Yeah, like we said, we did the bath study and it was good, but also, like at the end of it, you're glad it's done. So that's the balance we find with prescribing it to athletes, is how do you actually do this reliably long term?
Yeah, exactly. That is the reliability thing, and then it's looking at I think as much as anything else, raising kind of stuff that can be done very easily, because this started out by looking at things like the Marathon des Sables, where you sign up to a race in the desert and it's going to be hot. Well, I'm talking to you today and we're in the middle of a heat wave, And you wouldn't necessarily have predicted that if you're racing this weekend, you'd be racing in 35, 36 degrees in the UK. So are there things that are quite easy to put in place for athletes that are racing? We had London to Brighton a few weekends ago in a bit of a heat wave, or have races in the South Downs over the summer where it's going to be reaching high 20s, low 30s, and that presents a real issue for people. So I think it's only going to become more relevant for more people over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've never known it so hot in the UK, and when we've had these cooler patches, when normally 20 degrees you wouldn't normally say is cool in the UK, but it feels cool now. And actually, I can just see my heart rate is much lower, my sweat rate is higher, and it just feels more comfortable. Most importantly, 20 degrees does feel cool, whereas normally I'd be struggling in 20 degrees, complaining and moaning like everybody else. Yeah, but as you said, I think we're only heating up, aren't we? So it's only going to be more relevant.
That was all I had for you, James. Do you have any other questions, Dan?
No, that was really good. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed talking to you, James.
Yeah.
Anything else you think we should cover before we wrap things up?
Not really. I think the message really now with altitude is that it's always been this thing where elite athletes have gone for 4 weeks, 5 weeks at a time and done their altitude training camps, which is great. But actually, there are so many different ways that people at all levels can benefit from it in some way, shape, or form. And I'm really trying to get that out there, that it's just another training technique. People are aware of the hot baths and the sauna and stuff like that. Actually, altitude isn't as inaccessible as maybe people thought previously.
Yeah, I think people are starting to get more creative with it, aren't they, and using it as a tool. And yeah, it'll be really exciting to see where things go. We're lining up sequentially the different stimuli: heat, altitude, for example. Yeah, don't forget about altitude. Is that the key message? It's still good.
It's funny that, yeah.
Cool.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for your time, James. Really good to talk to you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it.